The room went silent so fast I could actually hear the ice shift inside somebody's whiskey glass. A second earlier, my father-in-law had been laughing so hard he had tears in his eyes. His golfing buddies were smirking. My sister-in-law had her phone half raised, probably recording the whole thing for one of those cruel little family group chats they thought I never knew about. And my husband, he just sat there, quiet, ashamed of me. Then the television behind them flickered to life. At first, nobody understood what they were seeing. Dust, smoke, men screaming, gunfire echoing through a canyon somewhere on the other side of the world. Then the image sharpened. A soldier in full combat gear dragged a bleeding man across the dirt while bullets ripped through the air overhead. Someone near the fireplace whispered, "Oh my God," because the soldier was me. And the man I was carrying was Ethan. The same husband whose father had just announced to 50 people that nobody had ever wanted me. I looked at Richard Bennett over the rim of my wine glass and smiled. "You should probably sit down," I said softly. "The next part gets worse." Part 1. By the time I arrived at Richard Bennett's birthday party, the candles had already been lit once. The Bennetts loved appearances more than honesty, and lateness was treated like a character flaw in that family. It didn't matter that I had driven 3 hours from Fort Belvoir after sitting through a 12-hour intelligence briefing. It didn't matter that I was still carrying a dull headache behind my eyes from lack of sleep. To them, being late simply meant being disrespectful. I parked beside a line of polished luxury cars in front of Richard's sprawling Virginia estate and sat inside my SUV for a moment longer than necessary. The porch lights glowed gold against the cold March evening. Expensive laughter drifted through the open front doors. Somewhere inside, Frank Sinatra was playing softly through hidden speakers. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My dark hair was twisted into a clean, low bun. My makeup had mostly survived the day, though exhaustion shadowed the skin beneath my eyes. The only thing that still looked perfectly untouched was my uniform. Captain Claire Bennett. Military intelligence. 8 years of service. 2 deployments. 1 Bronze Star. And somehow none of that had ever been enough for my husband's family. I grabbed Richard's gift from the passenger seat, a vintage Navy watch I'd spent weeks hunting down, and stepped out into the cold. The moment I walked inside, conversations shifted. Not stopped. Shifted. The way people do when they've already been talking about you. My mother-in-law Diane kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. "Claire," she said brightly, "you made it." Made it. As if I'd almost failed some invisible audition. "You're late," my sister-in-law Vanessa added from beside the dining room table. Again. I smiled politely. "Good to see you too, Vanessa." Her eyes skimmed over my uniform. "Still wearing that everywhere, huh?" I ignored the comment the same way I'd ignored hundreds before it. That was the thing about military training nobody talked about. People think it teaches you how to fight. Mostly it teaches you how to absorb discomfort without reacting. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine spread. Crystal glasses, silver serving trays, white roses arranged down the center of the table. Richard Bennett sat at the head like a king, holding court, one hand wrapped around a cigar he technically wasn't supposed to smoke anymore. At 70 years old, Richard still carried himself like a man who believed the world owed him admiration. Former CEO Country Club board member. Donor plaques with his name carved into hospital walls. He noticed me standing near the doorway and raised his glass. "Well," he announced loudly enough for half the room to hear, "our mysterious soldier finally arrived." A few people chuckled. I crossed the room and handed him the wrapped watch box. "Happy birthday, Richard." He accepted it without opening it. "You didn't have to spend your government paycheck on me." More laughter. I saw Ethan tense slightly in his chair, but not enough to say anything. That hurt more than the joke itself. My husband used to defend me once. Back when we first met, he admired my discipline, my independence, the fact that I could walk into any room and never need permission to belong there. But somewhere over the years, admiration had turned into discomfort. The military wife people expected him to have looked very different from me. She baked casseroles, hosted brunches, smiled softly beside him in photographs. She did not disappear overseas for months at a time and come home quieter than before. Dinner began shortly afterward. Conversations rolled around me like waves I no longer tried to enter. Investments, vacation homes, somebody's son applying to Yale. I mostly listened. That was another thing deployments changed in you. After hearing men cry for medics in the dark, small talk started sounding strange. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa leaned toward Diane and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I still don't understand how Claire survives eating military food all the time. Isn't it basically canned beans and depression?" The table laughed. I cut another piece of steak carefully. "You'd be surprised what people can survive." Vanessa smirked, missing the meaning entirely. Across from me, Ethan stared into his wine glass. He had changed so gradually over the years, I sometimes struggled to identify when exactly I started feeling lonely beside him. Maybe it was after Afghanistan. Maybe after the nightmares began. Maybe after his father started convincing him that strength in a woman somehow diminished the man standing next to her. Richard wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said casually, "when Ethan first brought Claire home, I assumed it was temporary." My stomach tightened. The room quieted instinctively. People loved tension as long as it belonged to someone else. Richard smiled at his guests. I thought eventually he'd settle down with someone a little more. He waved vaguely. Approachable. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered around the table. Ethan finally looked up. "Dad." But Richard kept going. Hell, nobody wanted to marry a woman like that. He gestured loosely toward me with his bourbon glass. Ethan only did it because he felt sorry for her. The laughter came harder this time. Real laughter. Not nervous, not hesitant. Vanessa nearly spit out her wine. One of Richard's golf buddies slapped the table. Even Diane covered her mouth trying to hide a smile. And Ethan. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. For one strange second, all I could hear was the soft hum of the chandelier overhead. I looked around the room slowly. At the people who had eaten food I paid for during Richard's bankruptcy scare. At the people who vacationed in houses my private consulting work had helped save. At the husband whose life had once literally rested in my hands. Then I smiled. Not angrily. Not emotionally. Just calmly. Because something inside me finally became very, very still. Richard pointed his cigar toward me. "Ah, don't look so serious, Claire. We're joking." Funny thing about humiliation is that people always call it a joke after they see your face. I dabbed my mouth with my napkin and stood slowly from the table. "You're right," I said softly. "This is funny." Richard grinned, thinking he'd won. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Ethan frowned immediately. "Claire?" But I was already walking toward the massive television mounted above the stone fireplace. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor. The room watched me with mild curiosity, expecting tears maybe, or an argument. Instead, I connected my phone to the television. The screen turned black, then paused on a grainy image covered in dust and smoke. Ethan went pale so quickly it frightened me a little, because he recognized the footage before anyone else did. I glanced back at Richard. "Funny thing about pity," I said quietly. "Sometimes it blinds people." Then I pressed play. The first sound that came from the television was screaming. Not the polished kind people hear in movies. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Real screaming. Panicked. Raw. The kind that comes from human beings who suddenly realize death is very close and moving quickly. Several guests jerked in their seats. Dust exploded across the screen as gunfire cracked through the speakers. The footage shook violently, the camera whipping between shattered concrete walls and smoke-blackened vehicles. "What the hell is this?" Richard muttered. I didn't answer. On screen, someone yelled, "Move, move, move." Then the image steadied just enough for the room to understand what they were looking at. Afghanistan. A convoy attack. Men bleeding in the dirt. And in the middle of it all, a soldier in combat gear dragging a civilian toward cover, while bullets tore into the road behind them. The soldier was me. The civilian was Ethan. I heard Diane inhale sharply beside the dining table. "Oh my God," one of the guests whispered. Nobody laughed now. The footage came from my helmet camera during my second deployment, recorded nearly 6 years earlier outside Bagram. I hadn't watched it in a long time. I usually avoided it. Some memories age like wounds beneath the skin. They close on the surface but ache whenever pressure returns. On screen, I dropped behind a burned-out transport truck and pressed both hands against Ethan's chest. Blood soaked through his shirt. "Stay awake," my younger voice shouted. Ethan's eyes fluttered on the screen, terrified, barely conscious. The television speakers filled the room with nearby gunfire and frantic radio chatter. Then another explosion hit. Several people at the party physically flinched. Vanessa stared at the screen, frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. The video cut briefly to static before continuing again. This time it showed me sprinting back into open fire toward another injured contractor trapped beside an overturned vehicle. Someone behind me whispered, "She went back." Twice. Actually 3 times, but they didn't know that yet. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Claire, turn this off." I ignored him. The room watched silently as smoke swallowed the screen again. Then my voice came through the speakers, breathless and strained. "We have civilians trapped. I need another extraction vehicle now." A younger soldier answered through gunfire, "Captain Bennett, you need to fall back." I said, "Move." Even hearing my own voice again felt strange. Harder. Sharper. The version of me in that footage had not yet learned how disappointment inside a marriage could feel lonelier than war. The footage continued. There I was dragging Ethan again, one arm hooked beneath his shoulders, while rounds snapped through the air around us. Ethan made a small sound behind me in the dining room. Not words. Shame. I finally looked at him directly. His face had gone colorless. He knew exactly what everybody in that room was realizing. The man whose family mocked me tonight would have died in Afghanistan if I had acted like the weak woman they believed me to be. The video ended on medics loading Ethan into a transport vehicle while another soldier shouted over the noise. "Captain Bennett saved 6 civilians today." The screen froze. Silence swallowed the room. Even the music had stopped somehow. Richard cleared his throat. "Well, that was certainly dramatic." I almost smiled. Even now he was trying to minimize it. That generation of men would watch a building collapse and still ask whether someone had scratched the paint. I turned slowly toward him. "The man you said married me out of pity spent 6 months begging me not to leave him after that deployment." Richard's jaw tightened. I continued calmly. "He cried in a military hospital because he thought I was transferring overseas without him." Vanessa blinked hard. "Ethan, is that true?" My husband didn't answer. "Because it was." Every word. I picked up the remote from the coffee table and pressed another button. Ethan stood abruptly. "Claire, don't." I looked at him evenly. "Sit down." Something in my voice made him obey before he even realized he'd done it. The next video began immediately. Hospital footage. Quiet this time. Soft fluorescent lighting replaced gunfire and smoke. Ethan sat in a hospital bed with bruises across his face and bandages wrapped around his ribs. He looked younger there, fragile. A nurse behind him adjusted an IV line while he stared toward the person holding the camera. Me. "You almost died," he said weakly in the recording. "Off camera," my voice answered, "so did you." He shook his head. "No, Claire, you came back for me." The room behind me remained perfectly silent. On screen, Ethan swallowed hard before speaking again. "You're the only reason I'm alive." Nobody moved. Not Richard. Not Diane. Not Vanessa. Not the smug golf buddies who had laughed 20 minutes earlier. I watched their expressions change one by one, and honestly, that was the moment I realized humiliation has weight to it. Real physical weight. Because I could almost see it settling onto their shoulders all at once. Diane sat down slowly as though her knees had weakened. "Oh my God," she whispered again, softer this time. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "Claire, please." Please. Interesting word. Men usually discover tenderness only after power shifts away from them. I muted the television. The sudden silence rang louder than the footage itself. Then I faced the room. "You all think you know me," I said quietly, "but the truth is none of you ever cared enough to ask who I actually was." Nobody interrupted. I listened to years of jokes in this house. My voice stayed calm. About my deployments, my uniform, my marriage, my age, my inability to fit in. Vanessa lowered her eyes. "You called me cold because I didn't cry at dinner tables. You called me difficult because I worked too much. You called me intimidating because silence makes insecure people uncomfortable." Richard scoffed lightly. Oh, come on now. No, I cut him off without raising my voice. You had your turn. That shut him up instantly. I walked slowly toward the dining table again. I spent years believing respect could be earned through patience. I looked around the room carefully. Turns out people only respect sacrifice when they can see blood attached to it. Nobody breathed. Then Ethan stood again more carefully this time. Claire, he said quietly, you're embarrassing everyone. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Embarrassing everyone. That was what he chose. Not cruel. Not unfair. Embarrassing. I tilted my head slightly. That's interesting coming from a man who let his father publicly announce nobody wanted his wife. Ethan's face tightened. Richard finally snapped, "This family has done nothing but support you." There it was. The lie they had repeated for years. Support. As though tolerance deserved applause. I looked directly at him. Support me. Then I picked up my phone again. You know what's fascinating about wealthy families, Richard? I asked softly. Everybody assumes the money comes from the loudest person in the room. A flicker crossed his face. Tiny. But I saw it. And suddenly Ethan looked terrified again. That was when I knew neither of them expected me to go this far. Good. I tapped another folder on my screen. The television changed from combat footage to spreadsheets, wire transfers, and scanned documents. Across the top of the screen in bold letters appeared, family accounts. And for the first time all evening, Richard Bennett stopped looking powerful. At first, most people in the room didn't understand what they were looking at. The television screen displayed bank statements, corporate filings, transaction histories, and scanned loan agreements layered across a dark background. Cold numbers, dates, signatures. Not dramatic enough for Richard Bennett's crowd. Not yet. Richard gave a short laugh that sounded far less confident than before. Claire, what exactly is this supposed to prove? I didn't answer immediately. I walked slowly back toward the dining table, picked up my untouched wine glass, and took a small sip while the screen behind me continued cycling through financial records. The room felt different now. Heavy. People who had spent the last hour relaxed in expensive clothing suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable inside their own skin. Because instinctively they understood something dangerous was happening. Not emotional danger. Reputational danger. And families like the Bennetts feared humiliation more than death. I finally set the glass down. The Bennett Development Group almost collapsed 4 years ago, I said calmly. Most of you probably remember that as a difficult fiscal quarter. Richard's jaw tightened. Several guests exchanged glances. Nobody had known the truth publicly, of course. Richard had buried the situation beneath polished interviews, staged charity appearances, and carefully managed press releases. But I knew exactly how close the company came to dying. Because I was the one who kept it alive. A document enlarged on the television screen. Wire transfer $380,000. Another appeared beside it. Consulting Payment Defense Analysis Division. Then another. Private intelligence contract authorized payment. Vanessa frowned. Wait, what is this? I looked at her. My income. Confusion spread slowly around the room. People still assumed military officers lived on modest salaries alone. They had no idea that after my second deployment, I'd been recruited into private defense consulting work tied to strategic intelligence analysis. Long nights, classified briefings, government contracts that demanded silence and rewarded it generously. Work I rarely talked about because people like the Bennetts only respected money when men earned it loudly. On screen, another document appeared. Transfer to Bennett Development Group. Amount $1.2 million. Diane physically covered her mouth. No, she whispered. Richard stood abruptly. Turn this off right now. I met his eyes evenly. Sit down. For a moment, I thought he might actually refuse. Then he noticed everyone watching him. Slowly, stiffly, he sat back down. That small surrender changed the entire room. I walked toward the television. 4 years ago, I continued, your company was 6 weeks away from bankruptcy. The banks were already preparing legal action. Vendors stopped extending credit. Payroll was in danger. I glanced toward Ethan. He knows. My husband stared at the floor. Of course he knew. He had cried in our kitchen at 2 a.m. while stacks of unpaid invoices covered the table between us. I still remembered the shaking in his hands. We're going to lose everything, he'd whispered back then. And because I loved him at the time, I answered the way wives do when they still believe sacrifice will eventually be remembered. I'll fix it. I turned back toward the guests. So I liquidated part of my retirement portfolio, took additional consulting contracts overseas, and transferred enough capital to stabilize the company. One of Richard's business partners blinked in disbelief. You funded the restructuring. I nodded once. The older man looked stunned. Richard told us he negotiated private financing. A bitter smile touched my mouth. He did receive private financing. Richard's face reddened visibly now. Vanessa stared at her father. Dad, is this true? He snapped immediately. You don't understand how business works. No, I said softly. They understand perfectly now. The screen shifted again. Hospital invoices. Medical bills. Mortgage payments. Personal loans. All linked back to accounts under my name. Diane looked like she might faint. That surgery, she whispered weakly. Richard told me insurance covered the difference. I looked at her gently for the first time all night. It didn't. Tears immediately filled her eyes. 3 years earlier, Diane had needed emergency cardiac surgery after complications doctors discovered too late. Insurance covered part of it, not enough. Richard had come to me privately. Not proudly. Not confidently. Begging. The memory still lived clearly in my mind. His hands trembling slightly inside my office. His voice lowered with humiliation. Please don't tell the family. I hadn't. Until tonight. The television displayed the scanned email. From Richard Bennett, subject personal request. Claire. I would appreciate your discretion regarding this matter. I fully intend to repay the money once business improves. Please don't mention this to Diane or the children. Richard. A quiet gasp moved through the room. Richard looked suddenly older than 70. Not because his secrets were exposed. Because his authority was collapsing. Powerful men age quickly once people stop pretending to believe them. You humiliated me publicly, I said quietly. So I decided the truth deserved an audience too. Ethan finally stood again. Claire, enough. I turned toward him slowly. No, I said, not yet. Something flickered across his face then. Fear. Real fear. Because he knew there was more. There was always more. I walked toward the fireplace while the screen behind me changed again. This time it showed photographs. Corporate dinners. Fundraisers. Holiday parties. In every single one, Ethan stood proudly beside people congratulating him for saving the family business. I remembered every event. Every handshake. Every lie. You know what hurt the most? I asked quietly. It wasn't the insults. The room stayed perfectly still. It was sitting beside my husband while he accepted praise for sacrifices he knew came from me. Ethan swallowed hard. One photo enlarged behind us. A newspaper clipping. Local entrepreneur saves family company. Featuring Ethan smiling confidently outside corporate headquarters. I looked directly at him. You never corrected them. His voice came low and strained. I was trying to protect the family. I laughed softly again. No, you were protecting your ego. That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Because it was true. The room knew it. Even Ethan knew it. Vanessa sat down slowly in her chair like someone realizing she had misunderstood an entire person for years. I thought. She hesitated. I thought you barely contributed financially. I looked at her calmly. That's because your brother wanted you to think that. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Cowardice exhausts people eventually. That was the irony. Lies require constant maintenance. Truth simply waits. One of Richard's friends cleared his throat awkwardly. Richard, maybe we should. No, Richard barked suddenly. She's trying to destroy this family. I turned toward him fully. No, Richard. My voice remained almost frighteningly calm. I protected this family. Silence again. Then I added quietly, for years. The weight of that sentence settled into the room slowly. I could see people recalculating every interaction they'd ever had with me, every joke, every dismissive glance, every assumption. Not one of them had ever imagined the quiet woman at the end of the table was the reason the lights stayed on. I picked up my phone again. Ethan's eyes widened instantly. "Claire." That tone again. Desperation now. Good. Because he finally understood something I had learned overseas a long time ago. The most dangerous people are usually the calm ones. I opened another file. Audio. Just audio. No video this time. The screen displayed only a date from 8 months earlier. And suddenly Ethan looked like a man watching his own execution approach in slow motion. I met his eyes one final time. "I could forgive disrespect," I said softly. Then I pressed play. But not betrayal. At first, all anyone heard was the sound of ice clinking softly in a glass. Then Ethan's voice came through the speakers. Clear. Relaxed. Careless in the way people become when they believe nobody else will ever hear them. "We just need a little more time," he said in the recording. "Once the company stabilizes, I'll divorce her." Nobody in the room moved. Not even breathing, it seemed. Then Richard's voice answered calmly through the television speakers. "Good." A pause. A low chuckle. She was useful, nothing more. The silence that followed inside the dining room felt almost supernatural. Diane's face drained of color so fast I thought she might collapse. Vanessa physically stepped backward from her brother like she no longer recognized him. And Ethan. He looked at me with pure panic. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Panic. Because there are lies people think they can explain away. Affairs, financial secrets, cruel words said during arguments. But there is something uniquely devastating about hearing your own voice, calmly discussing the destruction of someone who loved you. The recording continued. Ethan laughed softly. "Honestly, I don't even think she'd fight it. Claire's too disciplined for drama." Richard answered, "That's the benefit of marrying women like her. They mistake endurance for love." Diane let out a broken sound beside the table. "Richard," she whispered. But the recording wasn't finished. Ethan spoke again, lower this time. "She's gone half the year anyway. Sometimes it barely feels like I'm married." Another small laugh. Then Richard. "Well, once the company fully recovers, you won't need her money anymore." Click. The audio ended. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked loudly through the silence, each second stretching painfully longer than normal. I looked around the room slowly. At the guests staring at Ethan with open disgust. At Vanessa, whose eyes had filled with tears. At Diane, who looked like 30 years of marriage had suddenly become unrecognizable. And finally at Richard Bennett. For the first time since I'd known him, the man genuinely looked afraid. Not because he'd been exposed financially, because he'd lost control of the room. Men like Richard build their entire identities around controlling perception. They survive through authority, charisma, intimidation. The illusion matters more than the truth. And tonight the illusion had shattered publicly. Ethan finally found his voice. "Claire, listen to me." I tilted my head slightly. I already did. His breathing turned uneven. That conversation, it wasn't what it sounded like. I almost admired the instinct. Human beings will deny gravity itself before admitting cruelty out loud. "No," I asked quietly. He stepped toward me carefully, like approaching something dangerous. I was under pressure. My dad was pushing me constantly. The business was collapsing. "And your solution," I interrupted calmly, "was to plan your exit strategy while accepting my money behind my back. That's not fair." I stared at him for a long moment. Then I said softly, "Neither was loving someone who saw me as temporary." That hit him harder than yelling would have. His shoulders physically dropped. Across the room, Richard suddenly slammed one hand against the dining table. Enough of this self-righteous performance. Several guests flinched. He pointed at me with a trembling finger. "You recorded private conversations. You ambushed this family in our own home." I met his rage without blinking. "You publicly humiliated me first." That was a joke. No, my voice remained perfectly level. It was honesty. Tonight is honesty too. The room fell quiet again. I could feel people shifting emotionally now, no longer watching entertainment but witnessing consequences. That changes the atmosphere entirely. Because revenge is exciting until someone recognizes themselves in it. Diane slowly sat down in her chair, staring at Ethan like a stranger. "You were really going to leave her?" she asked weakly. Ethan ran both hands through his hair. "Mom. After everything she did for this family." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there was no defense left. Not a believable one. Vanessa wiped beneath her eyes angrily. "My God, Ethan, she saved your life." The words hung heavily in the air. She saved your life. And somehow that made the betrayal uglier. People can rationalize selfishness, but ingratitude disgusts them. Especially older Americans, especially families. I walked slowly toward the fireplace again and muted the television screen entirely. The dark reflection staring back at us now felt strangely intimate. Everyone looked older in it somehow. "I found that recording 8 months ago," I said quietly. Ethan's eyes snapped toward me. "You knew." "Yes." The room absorbed that slowly. 8 months. 8 months of family dinners, holidays, smiles, shared beds, conversations. All while I already knew. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Then why wait until now?" I looked directly at him. "Because humiliation feels different when witnesses are involved." Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. The truth of it landed too hard. Richard had humiliated me publicly, because public humiliation creates power. It isolates the victim, makes people laugh along out of social instinct. Tonight I simply returned the experience. Only this time the truth was on my side. Ethan took another step closer. "Claire, please, we can fix this." I stared at him carefully. There was a time hearing that voice crack would have destroyed me emotionally, a time I would have folded instantly just to preserve the marriage. But grief changes shape eventually. If you hold it long enough, it hardens into clarity. "No," I said softly. "You can't fix a relationship built around convenience." His eyes reddened immediately. "I loved you." I smiled sadly. "You loved what I provided." That sentence broke something in him. I saw it happen. His face collapsed inward slightly, like a structure finally giving way after years of hidden damage. Meanwhile, Richard tried one last time to regain control. "You think exposing us makes you powerful?" he spat. "You're still alone at the end of this." I looked at him calmly. "No," I answered. "I'm free." Then I reached into my purse again. Richard frowned. Ethan went pale all over again. Because he remembered something his father didn't. I always finished what I started. I pulled out a thin folder and placed it carefully onto the dining table. "What's that?" Diane whispered. I slid the documents toward Richard. He opened them slowly and stopped breathing. His eyes moved across the first page once. Then again. "No," he whispered. I finally allowed myself the smallest smile of the evening. "The Bennett Development Group's emergency capital account closed this morning," I said. "I withdrew every remaining dollar connected to my investments." Richard looked physically ill now. "You can't do that." "I already did." Ethan stared at me in horror. "Claire!" "The bank takes over restructuring Monday morning?" I continued quietly. "Without outside capital protection, your creditors accelerated collection." Richard's hands began shaking. Years. Decades of reputation and control. Collapsing in real time beneath expensive chandelier lighting while 50 silent witnesses watched. I leaned slightly closer to him. "You called me unwanted," I said softly. His eyes lifted toward mine. "Yet your entire family survived because of me." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Richard Bennett, the loudest man in every room for 40 years, suddenly looked very small. I slipped my wedding ring slowly from my finger. Set it gently on the table beside his bourbon glass. The tiny sound it made against the wood somehow echoed louder than shouting. Then I looked at Ethan one final time. "Now survive without me." And I walked toward the front door. Behind me, nobody tried to laugh anymore. The cold night air hit my face the second I stepped outside Richard Bennett's house. For the first time in years, I could breathe properly. Not deeply. Not peacefully. But honestly, behind me through the massive windows of the estate, I could still see movement inside the dining room. Shadows crossing quickly, people arguing, one disaster unfolding into several more. I stood at the top of the stone staircase for a moment and looked out across the quiet Virginia neighborhood. Everything appeared calm. Perfect lawns. warm porch lights, luxury cars lined neatly along the curb. It struck me then how often destruction happens in silence. Not with explosions. Not with screaming. Just one truth entering a room where lies have lived comfortably for too long. The front door opened behind me. Claire. Ethan. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly before turning around. He jogged down the front steps toward me without his jacket, his face pale from panic and humiliation. He looked nothing like the confident man from those corporate magazine articles anymore. Now he just looked tired. Human. Too late. Please don't leave like this, he said breathlessly. I studied him quietly beneath the porch light. For years I had loved this man so completely that I built entire futures around his happiness. I defended him to people who warned me he was becoming too much like his father. I ignored loneliness because marriage sometimes requires endurance. But endurance without respect eventually becomes self-destruction. You should go back inside, I told him softly. He shook his head immediately. Claire, listen to me. I was angry when I said those things. I didn't mean them. That recording lasted 12 minutes, Ethan. His face crumpled slightly. People rarely understand how revealing desperation can be until they hear themselves bargaining after consequences arrive. I was scared, he whispered. Everything was falling apart back then. I nodded once. I know, that's why I stayed. The pain that crossed his face then was real. But so was mine. He stepped closer carefully. I loved you the best way I knew how. I looked at him for a very long time before answering. That was the problem. The wind shifted between us, cold against my skin. Inside the house, someone raised their voice sharply. Probably Richard. Men like him don't collapse gracefully. They lash out at whoever remains nearby. Ethan glanced toward the house before looking back at me again. What happens now? Such a simple question. Such a terrifying one after 15 years with someone. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed inside this marriage. The hopeful newlywed. The exhausted officer taking calls from overseas at 3 a.m. The woman silently paying bills nobody thanked her for. The wife sitting through cruel little jokes because she believed loyalty mattered more than pride. And finally this version. The one standing outside in the cold, no longer asking permission to be respected. I go home, I said quietly. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Claire. You loved what I could carry for you, I continued gently. The money, the stability, the strength. But you never really loved me enough to stand beside me when it cost something. He lowered his head. Because he knew. Deep down he had always known. I stepped around him and walked toward my SUV. Claire, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. His voice broke behind me. I'm sorry. For a second I almost let myself mourn the life we could have had if he'd been braver. Then I remembered the sound of everyone laughing at that dinner table while he stared silently into his wine glass. Some moments clarify an entire marriage. That apology belongs to the version of me that still needed it, I said softly. Then I got into my vehicle and drove away. The divorce finalized 6 months later. Quietly. No dramatic court battle, no public statements. Ethan's lawyers pushed for portions of my consulting income at first, until my attorneys revealed exactly how much undocumented financial support I had already provided his family over the years. After that, negotiations ended quickly. The Bennett Development Group collapsed before Christmas. Without emergency capital protection, creditors moved aggressively. Lawsuits followed. Investors disappeared. Country club friends stopped returning Richard's calls. Reputation is strange that way. People admire power until weakness becomes visible. Then suddenly they remember morality. Vanessa sent me a letter eventually. Handwritten. She apologized for years of cruelty she claimed she hadn't fully understood until that night. Diane sent flowers twice. I never responded to either. Not out of anger. Just distance. Some bridges don't burn dramatically. They simply stop leading anywhere worth returning to. A year later, I accepted a senior strategic advisory position near Arlington and relocated permanently to Virginia. Smaller townhouse, quieter life, no performances required. Some evenings I still woke from deployment nightmares. Some scars don't care whether wars are over. But slowly life became lighter. One rainy Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 years after Richard's birthday party, I received a handwritten envelope at my office. Inside was a letter from a woman in Colorado. Her husband had been one of the civilians evacuated during the convoy attack in Afghanistan years earlier. He'd passed away recently from cancer. Before dying, he told her repeatedly about the female officer who ran back into gunfire when everyone else was retreating. The woman thanked me for giving her husband 10 more years of life. I sat alone in my office after reading that letter. And for the first time in a very long while, I cried. Not because of Ethan. Not because of the Bennetts. But because after years of being treated like something cold and difficult and unfeminine, someone finally remembered me for what I truly was. A person who stayed when staying was hard. That night I drove home beneath soft Virginia rain with the windows cracked slightly open. The world outside smelled clean. At a red light I caught my reflection faintly in the glass. Older now. Softer around the eyes. But stronger in ways nobody at Richard Bennett's table would ever understand. Because silence was never weakness. Discipline was never emptiness. And dignity, real dignity, doesn't scream to prove itself. It waits, then tells the truth once, and lets the silence do the rest. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to walk away from people who only valued you for what you could give them. We share stories like this every day. Stories about strength, betrayal, resilience, and finding yourself again after heartbreak. So if you'd like more journeys like Claire's, make sure you subscribe and stay with us for the next story.